Here we start getting into our non-bony fish, or our cartilaginous fish. Now, it's confusing to some because they technically have bones. They're just not calcium bones. The bones are made of cartilage. It seems hard, but think about your nose and your ear. Your ear would be soft cartilage, your nose is hard cartilage. If you look at this fish in the middle of the slide, roughly, it's called a skate. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see what's called a skate wing. I don't know if you look closely at that skate, you may see the outline, the same outline of the shape that you see in the fabricated wing, almost like they take the whole interior body and cut it out like an hourglass. And they'll ship us 2 skin-on wings. And the reason they do that is, first off, they take out the cheeks, and skate cheeks get sold for a much higher premium. And then also, it drains the uric acid, because skate sharks and rays do not have a vent. So they drain through their skin, and if they left it in there, you would start to have an ammonia-like buildup. And that would not be good for any customer. It would be very pungent. Yet some people, some cultures, and not knocking them, like it. If you were to go to Iceland, they like to bury sharks uncut, and then the ammonia starts to cure or pickle the flesh. We just like to do a quick saute. Skate is an interesting flesh. It softens the longer you cook it. Most animal proteins we know of firm up when you cook them. Think about chopped meat, think about egg whites. Plant proteins tend to soften when we cook them, and this acts more like a plant protein. It actually even tastes more like a plant. Skate very often can taste like asparagus or corn. One of the most easily identifiable non-bony cartilaginous fish would be sharks. On the East Coast, mako and dogfish are the most common to eat, and some people will refer to mako as the poor man's swordfish. At the 3 o'clock mark, you can see a guy who just caught a mako, and he's hanging it over the edge of the boat. The bottom picture shows a time-lapse shutter or multiple exposure photo of leaping makos. Makos can jump about 1 foot out of the water for every length they are long, and then they like to land on their prey. If you really want to see in action, get on YouTube and type in leaping mako sharks. You may never go swimming again. At 9 o'clock, you see the spiny dogfish. It's a very popular shark that we bring into campus quite a bit for fabrication in the summer months. It makes a nice kebab. It makes a nice grill item. It's supposedly the original fish and chips fish from England. And then at 12 o'clock, the top, you see these shark fins. I am not advocating it. I actually think it's a tragedy. I'm very against killing an animal just to use one part. If you want to learn more about shark finning, type in Shark Bait by Gordon Ramsay into YouTube and watch this 40-minute documentary. It's the quietest you'll ever see Chef Ramsay in your life. He's just absolutely speechless. Right? I don't advocate going into a farm and cutting the rack out of a young baby lamb and letting it bleed out to death, and I certainly wouldn't cut the fins off of a shark and let it bleed out in the water. That's the equivalent. It's quite atrocious. Swordfish, another fish that's easily identifiable visually because it's a long sword-like bill used for hunting, is also, to me, very easily identified when it's fabricated. Check out those bloodlines. Surrounding those tree-like myotomes, you've got 2 bloodlines that form almost a letter Y. Okay? This fish is fun, or an interesting fact is it's born with scales as a juvenile and it loses it throughout its life. So don't look for those tight-fitting scales on this fish. It's a high-activity fish. Swordfish rarely, if ever, stop moving. That gives it a very oily feel and a very strong flavor. Now, swordfish is fascinating. I like to call it the gateway fish. When someone comes into my classroom and says, I don't like fish, and we do our tastings, this is usually the species that I get people to change their mind. It actually has more of like a roasted pork aroma when you cook it and eat it. The monkfish is a fascinating species. You certainly do not want to confuse this with, everyone always asks me in class if this is the fish that's in Finding Nemo. That's a lanternfish. Although they both do have a fleshy appendage which comes off the top of their head. This guy is called an anglerfish because he uses it like a fishing pole. If you click on that link above, it'll take you to a wonderful video of a monkfish off the coast of Norway attracting a pollock. The fish, when we buy them, is usually head off. They will take out the cheeks. Monk cheeks are IQF, frozen, and very expensive. And then they take out the livers, and they're traditionally shipped off to Asia, where they are used, and they're called on chemo. It's very similar to foie gras. And then they take the tail section, and they'll ship it skin and bone in. And it looks like, if you were to peel it back, it's like pulling a pillowcase off inside out, off a pillow, and you're left with two tubular fillets connected to a cartilaginous spine. And those two fillets look like lobster tails. Why is it poor man's? Well, it's much cheaper than lobster. It's still not cheap, so really treat it with respect. The fish is mild in flavor. It's nice and sweet. It'll take to most cooking methods. You got to watch out for parasites. Look at the picture in the bottom right. That fish is eating a cod, so we know that there may possibly be codworms in there. Our last non-bony cartilaginous fish today is the sturgeon. Now in America, we have a few varieties of sturgeon. Here on the East Coast, we have the Atlantic sturgeon. In the Midwest, you would have the lake sturgeon, which you're looking at right there. And on the West Coast, they're known to have the white sturgeon. And that ranges usually from Northern California all the way up through British Columbia. Sturgeon was traditionally used for caviar. And then people started to notice that they liked the meat. In New York, you may see on menus something called Albany beef. Back in the old days, when the capital moved to Albany from Kingston, and there were many bars, they would harvest the roe from the Hudson River sturgeon, process it, make caviar, give it away in the bars so people would have salty food and they would be tempted to drink more. With a glut of the meat left over, which is really oily and greasy and fatty, they would refer to it as Albany beef. So it's a great fish for grilling, smoking, pan roasting. The roe out of a sturgeon is called caviar. On day 7, when we do the caviar tasting, or the last tasting day, we'll have many different caviars, but you need to know that in order to be called caviar, it has to come from a sturgeon. Everything else, you need to list the name of the fish. If you go outside, next to the admissions building, you'll see that 12-foot tall statue of the Atlantic sturgeon, which represents the fish in the Hudson River, made out of the 700 forks, knives, and spoons.